So Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. Learn something new every day. Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. I was just being a good student and reading my Intro to Theater textbook. Anyway, I'm Dr. Witt. I'm not feeling so good, and I wanted to lecture a little bit about the history of European theater from Rome all the way through Renaissance England. Join me, why don't you? So, you're probably asking, Dr. Witt, what are we going to cover today? Well, we got four things that we're going to cover. One, Rome. Two, medieval Europe. Three, Renaissance Italy. And four, Renaissance England. And I'll encourage you, because this is a video lecture, to stop, pause the video, and take any notes that you want. I'll go through rather fast. I don't know, depending on how fast you can listen, how fast you can read. But please do take the time to pause, write down notes, and then you can come back later and even write down the timestamp of the video. Then you'd be good to go. All right, let's get cracking. We're in Rome. We're going to start talking about the plays and the playwrights in Rome. So theater doesn't occupy a long time period of Roman history. We think of Rome and we associate that with theater, but actually theater did not make up a long period in terms of the entirety of the Roman Empire and Republic. If you look at how long the civilization existed, it's about 509 BCE to about 395 CE, and theater is just sort of a subset of that from about 240 BCE to 100 CE. Past 100 CE, we don't have many good records at all of theatrical performances taking place in a sustained manner. There's one off a few things, but it sort of declined at that point. The Romans borrowed from the Greeks culture, ideas, philosophy, and even their gods. But when you see that word borrow, let's switch that up with steal, because the Romans did take a lot of the information, especially on the cultural side of things, like plays, ideas, all kinds of stuff. Romans stole, which is fine. Civilization's been stealing from each other for thousands of years. Now, much like the Greeks started their theater as part of the religious festival, what was that religious festival again? Remember, we talked about it? In honor of which god? Dionysus, right, god of fertility, the harvest, music, and wine. Good thing to be the king, huh? Under the Roman times, the late Greeks really, bleeding into the Roman times, theater had become professionalized. In fact, the Greeks had this called Society of Dionysus, I believe, which is sort of like an international theater artist union because they would perform in different Greek colonies. Eventually, Rome comes to dominate the Mediterranean, conquers all of Greece and all the Greek colonies, and they also professionalize their theater. One innovation that the Romans do is they get rid of the chorus. Those big chorus of people, like when we read Antigone, there's a chorus of Theban elders. No more. No Theban elders. I said elders. I meant elders. Theban elders. No more. No chorus at all. However, ladies, this is one of those time periods in theater history where only men could perform. Still, sorry. Now, if we go on to a further discussion of plays and playwrights, remember that thing about the Romans borrowing from the Greeks? Yeah, stealing from the Greeks? Check this out. All Roman tragedies, so every known Roman tragedy, was not original. It was not unique. It was adapted or stolen, borrowed from Greek myths and legends. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans loved sex and violence. So the Greeks kept that stuff off stage. We would see the consequences of violence, right? We hear about the consequences of violence in Antigone. Antigone hangs herself. Haman draws his sword and rushes at Creon. But all that is told to us by other characters, and we don't see that happen on the stage, right? Same with, but that's different than what happens in Rome. In Rome, we see that on stage, including sex on stage. Yes, there was an emperor who said, if you guys are going to pretend to have sex, don't pretend, really do it. A real Roman emperor really said that to actors. A great example of that is Seneca's version of Medea. Now remember, the Romans always stole from the Greeks, so Euripides has a version of Medea. This is the Greek adaptation of that myth by this Roman playwright Seneca. It is bloody. We'll take a look at that in 1 second, but get your fingers ready in case it's too bloody for you. Now, what the Romans did like and did develop new works was in the genre of comedy. In comedy, specifically, the Greeks were not really credited with developing situation comedy. Maybe some of the new comics, maybe Menander did in the Greek times, but the Romans really take it upon themselves to develop two specific of those subgenres of comedy that we talked about before. One was farce, remember, slapstick, physical humor, broad physical humor, and two was situation comedy, where characters get into different wacky situations and how you get them out is where the comedy comes from. I warned you about it before, but now get ready because we're going to take a look at a very bloody, very violent adaptation that Seneca did of the non-bloody play tragedy Medea. Are you ready? Let's see. Medea's line at the top here, if this hand could be satisfied with the death of one, it would have sought no death at all. Though I slay two, still it is the count too small to appease my grief. If in my womb there still lurk any pledge of thee, I'll search my very vitals with the sword and hale it forth. This is a dispute that Medea is having with her husband Jason, who's decided to go off and marry this princess. Medea is so pissed she murders both of her children. Both. On stage. Let's keep reading. She's killed one already, draped over the side. Here's the second one. Thou biddest me pity. She slays the second son. 'Tis well, 'tis done. I had no more atonement to offer thee, O grief. Lift thy tear-swollen eyes hither, ungrateful Jason. She's yelling at her husband. Dost thou recognize thy wife? 'Tis thus I am wont to flee. A way through the air has opened for me. Two serpents offer their scaly necks bending to the yoke. Remember, Medea's escaping in her dragon chariot or serpent chariot to fly away. Awesome. Now, father, take back thy sons. She throws the bodies down to him. I, through the air on my winged car shall ride. So Medea kills two boys on stage and then throws them down to their father off of her serpent chariot. Pretty scary stuff. Greeks would not be having that on stage. Remember, they developed that whole couch with wheels, the ecce to bring out the dead bodies. Oh no, they're dead. And then put them back. But in contrast, Rome, knife, knife, throw them down. That's the play. Let's talk a little bit about technology in Roman theaters. So, Rome, just like Greece, had their theaters outdoors, open to the elements, to the sky. Primary light source was the sun. However, they don't discard all the Greek theaters that already existed. Remember, those things are carved in the freaking hillside. It's difficult to destroy that, right? It's the geography of the area. But what they do, you heard it here first, is they improve them with stone. That's what we receive nowadays, these stone finished theaters. It's not really until fairly late in the history of Rome, 55 BC, that Rome builds their first theater. And this is significant. It's called the Theater of Pompey in Rome. You should remember this. It's in yellow here. You should remember this for your midterm. A wink. So the innovation that Rome brings, the theater technology and theater spaces, is that they have freestanding theaters. That means the theater can be downtown. That means the theater can be right next to other things of interest, maybe next to your house. Whereas in the Greek times, you'd have to walk out to where the theater is, probably in the hillside near the town. But the Romans built it downtown, just like Manhattan, baby, theater district. That comes from the Romans. Here's a picture of a model of the Theater of Pompey in Rome, Rome's first freestanding theater. In fact, historians believe this is the first freestanding theater in the world, 55 BC. Remember that, and remember that number. The theater here is on the right side, and it's part of this sort of big temple, sort of political, religious complex, but this part is the theater. Until it's freestanding, it's in the cities. There's other houses, other structures, there's parks, there's all kinds of stuff around it. Now, what's something that the Romans invent? One thing that the Romans invent and use in their theater is the trapdoor. Trapdoor is an opening in the stage floor that will allow people to go down And if you have a lift or elevator, you can lift elements, or in the case of Rome, animals, sometimes wild animals like tigers, up into the performance area onto the stage. The second thing that the Romans developed is known as the facade. So that's a architectural background or backdrop that's used upstage over the actors would perform. And the third thing that the Romans developed that we're going to talk about is the vomitories or vomitorium. So that is the entrance for the audience to enter, and sometimes the actors to enter as well. That is sort of under the seats, under the seating area. The audience and actors could enter and exit through the vomitoria, or vomitories. And finally, this is not really an innovation, but another use, is that the Romans walled the orchestra area, and that was now a seating area for the VIPs, for the senators, for the rich people. Whereas, remember, the Greeks used the orchestra for the chorus. The Romans did away with the chorus, so they walled it and used it for VIP seating. Now, hopefully this video plays. It's a very short one. We'll see if it shows up. There's a Roman theater trapdoor and lift. This video is really cool, but look it up for yourself on YouTube. It's worth watching. So the ground plan of a Roman theater looks like this. This is an illustration from your book. It's slightly similar, pretty similar, I'd argue, to the Greek theater, but with some particular differences. First off, the audience is still sitting in that sort of semicircular fan shape, and it's elevated too, so it's up on an angle. The audience is not flat, it's elevated up. Just this time it's supported by internal structures and not by the ground itself, like in the Greek times. That's known as the cavea, or the audience. These sort of little caves are known as the vomitoria. So that's that area that's sort of like an archway. The audience would walk in and there'd be seating above and below them. If you've been to a football game, you might have entered the seating area through effectively what is a vomitoria. The orchestra here, we notice the orchestra is sort of cut in half. It's sort of the semicircle. And remember, it was walled and we had VIPs sitting there. So no actors would perform there during the Roman times. If we go upstage, we have that facade, that big stone facade, and we have 5 doors. Ancient Greeks had 3. Romans said 2 better, buddy. We have 5 doors. 3 in the upstage area, and then 1 right and left. And then finally a backstage area. The Romans also raised the stage a little bit higher than the Greeks did, and it's called a pulpitum, a raised stage. If you grew up in a church like I did, the preacher or the priest would talk at you, the talking part of the service, from the pulpit, right? It's a raised area where the priest would address the congregation. Somewhat similar to this raised stage. It'll help you remember that word. Here's an awesome 3D reconstruction. You can see the areas of a classical Roman theater. In fact, this is the theater of Pompey, which was constructed when? 55 BC, you got it. Here's the areas, the cavea. You can see the vomitoriums here, or the voms. Orchestra here, sort of a semicircle, a half circle. Pulpitum raised stage, and finally the facade, or sine frons there. Here's one. So this is in Athens. So this is in Greece, but this is a improved or modified Greek theater. The Romans made everything out of stone. You see the walled orchestra here. And a raised stage area with that stone facade up back. 3 doors upstage, 2 doors left and right. You got it. Here's another image. Now remember, the Roman Empire spanned all of the Mediterranean. So this is an example from North Africa of a Roman era theater. It's huge. It looks beautiful. And you notice the stonework is different than in the other theaters. Why is that? They use local stone. What's the sense of bringing all this stone from Greece if you got perfectly good stones right here in Libya to build it? Here's another image too in Orange in southern France. Pretty well restored, pretty well preserved Roman theater. And you notice too, this is in an urban environment. It's freestanding. It's self-supporting structure, not based on the geography. It's just based on wherever the architect wanted to put the theater. Next, we come to the Dark Ages, because there's no theater. And the Dark Ages came about because of 2 factors. First is that with the rise of Christianity came the decline in theater. Christians didn't like theater performers because they thought, in a certain sense, that theater performers, actors, were lying. They weren't being their true selves, and that was against one of the 10 Commandments in the Christian belief system. The other reason that theater declined and sort of died out, almost went extinct, was because Rome fell. Romans loved theater. No more Rome, no more theater. However, interestingly enough, even though Christians were anti-theater, the rebirth of theater, rediscovery of theater, came through the Christian church. And it came in a specific way. Theater began to be written rather than performed. People were writing what's known as closet dramas, written, for a good deal of time. From the 980s is when we have the earliest records of that. Now, what is a closet drama? A closet drama is a play which is written to be read primarily and not necessarily performed. Does that make sense? Now, why might someone do that? Well, one, it's not allowed to be performed. If the culture, if the area says you can't perform a play, well, that's okay. People don't just stop doing theater, they just stop doing performances of theater. So it would be primarily a written form. Let's talk a little bit about medieval European plays and playwrights in that vein. So, as we said before, theater comes back through the church. It comes back through this idea of liturgical drama, so drama within the church service itself. I think Christianity or church officials said, oh, theater could help educate our congregation, who are largely illiterate, so they wouldn't be reading the Bible, but they could watch a performance of somebody performing a story from the Bible. Maybe we could do that. Historians have researched this a lot. In fact, we have the first new play since the fall of Rome. It's like 400 years. You guys want to read it? Real short. All right, here we go. It's called the Quem Quaeritis trope, originally written in Latin. Here we go. Angel. Whom seek ye in the sepulchre, O Christians? And then the congregation would say, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, O angel. And the angel says, he is not here. He has arisen as he foretold. Go, announce that he has arisen from the grave. Scene. Thank you. Thank you. Hold your applause. Hold your applause. Your attention is all the applause that I need. But no, that's the truth. This is it. Quem Quaeritis trope. We just read a whole play today. A+. So, a little bit more about the plays and playwrights. The type of theater that was produced during the medieval times in Europe fell into a category that we can define as 3 M's and then 1 S. So what are these 3 M's? Maybe this would be better. An M? 3 M's. There we go. And 1 S. S. Anyway, let's get started. The first M is what's known as mystery plays. Those are pretty straight adaptations of stories from the Bible that people would then act out. So you get plays called like Noah's Ark or The Crucifixion, which depicts those events from the Bible. Pretty straightforward. Mystery plays. Don't think about like who killed somebody or who did it or what. Think about the mystery of God's creation to help you remember mystery plays. The second M is miracle plays. Those depicted the lives of Christian saints. Remember, saints are defined by creating some sort of miracle when they're alive. In fact, I think you have to have 2 verified miracles to be considered for sainthood, even in the modern Catholic Church. So these depict the lives of those individuals as a model for good Christian behavior among the congregation of the church. One play is called Dulcitius. It's written by the first known female playwright, whom we'll talk about a little bit later. That is the story of 3 sisters who eventually became saints. So the third M is known as a morality play. Morality plays are allegorical journeys where you have characters known as like Everyman, and he will encounter another character called Good Deeds or Lust or Gluttony and have to resist the impulses of those sins as he journeys from birth to death, and then to, if he's accepts the Christian belief system, goes to heaven. Right? So you get plays with titles like Everyman, The World and the Child, The Castle of Perseverance. These are all examples of European plays and playwrights. So those are the three M's. Boom. Let's do the S. The S stands for secular drama. Remember, secular means non-Christian. In this case, non-Christian. Secular just means non-religious at all. So these three M's were Christian influenced and many times produced by the church itself or its agents. But secular drama would be independent. That's secular, non-religious. Secular drama is usually, during the medieval times, comedy and farce. I don't think there's any evidence of tragedies that are written as secular dramas. Some of these other plays are tragedies, the three M's, but the S's are all comedies, usually farces. You get pretty basic stories depicted. One's called The Farce of the Fart. If you could imagine, maybe when you were growing up, you had a dispute with your brother or sister who farted. So imagine that, but as a play. And it just gets ridiculous. Husband and wife are at home. They're bending over to pick up the laundry. And as the play says, a fart occurs. Who farted? Each one blames the other. And eventually a judge is walking by and hears that and pulls them into court. And they adjudicate. They even get a lawyer pops up too. Who farted? It's absurd. And another one too is Worthy Master Pure Patlin. That's where these different characters are sort of scheming and trying to trick each other in order to get cloth or get free legal advice. Now, one of the playwrights we're going to focus on is known as Hroswitha of Gandersheim. Hroswitha was her name. Gandersheim is where she lived. In fact, she lived in Gandersheim Abbey, which still stands today in central Germany. She was not a nun, but she lived with nuns. She was what's known as a secular canoness, which is sort of like I think she was born to the nobility, but then just chose to live with nuns instead of getting married. But her significance is that she is the first known female playwright. Let's break that down. First known, because there's a lot of plays that are written anonymously with no author. They likely could have been written by a woman, but we just don't know. And female playwright, right? Important. First known female playwright. Here's her birth dates and death dates. She lived in Gandersheim Abbey, but was not a nun. And she wrote one of those three M's, the miracle closet dramas. So she wrote plays, and there's no evidence that they were performed. Perhaps they were performed. I think it likely she wrote these plays, and then in the abbey, the nuns would perform for themselves or for guests who could come into the abbey and walk around the town. But we don't have any records of them being performed. So the Dark Ages have the reputation for not developing much technology. But in the theater, they did make some sort of use of technology. In fact, they had large-scale productions, especially sponsored by the church. I'm talking like whole towns would get involved. A lot of people would be organized by the church to produce things. This is also where we get the first sort of director-type character known as a playmaster. That is a cool name, huh? We should bring that back. Who wants to be the director when he could be the playmaster? Got to bring that back, right? Now, because everything's being complicated, you have lots of people coming in and out and moving parts, that led to the development of what's known as the prompt book. That is the entire script of the play plus everything else that would happen on stage. So specific stage directions that the playmaster would give the actors. Production practices. If there's timing, if you're doing a big, large-scale Noah's flood, you need to know when people are going to release all the water when the Great Flood happens or something like that. All that has to be delineated in prompt books, some of which still survive. You can go and read them. Here's an image. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to take a look at this image, and you just think about what stands out to you. Right, so there's a lot going on here. Just some highlights here. We got Santa Claus in blue here pointing at this lady. This guy's using tongs to remove this woman's teeth. This guy's pulling hair. This guy over here on the left side scratching his butt. Bet you didn't notice that. And finally, we have this figure here in blue who has what looks to be a baton and a book. So scholars think that this is a play master, the sort of proto-director, and he's directing people with his baton and with the prompt book in front of him. This is a very small image. It's very low quality, but it's like very small. It's about this big originally. It's called the Martyrdom of Saint Apollonia. Saint Apollonia is the goddess of teeth, or not goddess of teeth, the saint of dental care, I guess. Because when she was martyred, her teeth were pulled out as a form of torture. So this is depicting that event happening. There you go, playmaster right there. What historians think is the playmaster. So that was an elaborate production, but not all medieval plays had elaborate production stuff. Many times they're very basic. Here's another illustration from your book. One of the production practices, if you talk about set and props, was to just use this, a mansion, a symbolic scenic unit, and the Platea, an open playing space. Many times with a curtain or just a basic backdrop. So not elaborate scenery, still fairly basic scenery. Now, what you could do is line lots of mansions and Platea up next to each other, like this, and actors would walk from one to the other. Stand in front of one, oh, now I'm here, do my performance, go to the next one, oh, now I'm here, do my performance there, and then, and on and on and on, to quickly change locations. This is an example of mansion and Platea for a play in northern France, in sort of the late Middle Ages here. Here's a clearer one where you can see this is probably for one of those 3M plays. This is probably for a morality play, because it's an allegorical journey of a soul from paradise, and then if you go to the right, to hell, right? The different temptations that would pull a person away from living a good, moral Christian life. I mean, look at these dudes over here. They're having a great time over here in hell. These demons, pitchforks, fire. Looks pretty crazy. But eventually the Middle Ages ended, stopped, and the Renaissance took over. Renaissance means rebirth. There was a interest in humanity, not necessarily just the domain of the gods, but let's think about humanity, of humanism, an explosion of thought. Now, this is an approximate date, 1500, your book gives. It wasn't like everybody went to sleep in 1499 in the Middle Ages and then woke up and said, oh, it's Renaissance in 1500. But it's a pretty good approximate date that many scholars put at the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance starts in different places in Europe at different times. The earliest, or the quickest to start the Renaissance, is generally considered Italy. And that's where we'll start now. So remember, that's rebirth. There was a renewed interest in things that we still are interested today: arts, sciences, and history, looking back on the past and seeing what we can learn from the past and bring it into the future. Before, that was not a thing. In the Middle Ages, they thought, just, look at the Word of God, look at the Bible, listen to your local priest, and that's how we progress. But nowadays, they think maybe we can look at history and get some progress. Another innovation that the Italian Renaissance brought us is that theater is now indoors. Whoa, you could go to the theater with a roof over your head, so no birds would poop on you or rain would rain on you, and you wouldn't have to rely on the sun for the lighting. That led us to artificial lighting. So how would they light these new plays that were now indoors? Revolutionary. Well, they'd use candles, they'd use oil lamps. Later on, they'd use gas lamps or gaslight, and finally, like we do today, electricity. There's a slow, steady progression towards that. Another innovation that comes from the Italian Renaissance is the idea of the proscenium arch theater, the box through which we view things, the proscenium arch. When we talk about theater space, we'll get more into depth into what that is. But proscenium arch is still used today to define theater spaces. Where is the acting space? Where is offstage? Where is front of stage? Where is backstage? And how to create a better illusion by looking at the theater that happens inside that proscenium arch, inside that box. On this campus, the Waterman Theater in Tyler Hall is a proscenium arch theater. The proscenium arch, because it defines how you're seeing something, allows perspective. So you could paint scenery so it looks like the illusion of 3 dimensions, but actually it's just flat painted 2-dimensional panes. This also allows an innovation, vanishing point perspective. Something looks very far away. Actually, it's just maybe 20 feet away, but you can paint it as such and direct the audience's gaze so that it looks like it's 100 feet away. Revolutionary. This is the Roman amphitheater, and you can see how maybe if you just sort of close this off, you would get pretty close to a proscenium theater. This is the first proscenium theater. Yeah. It looks pretty similar to that old Roman theater, and that's what the Italian Renaissance people saw. They still had these Roman theaters kicking around. What if we sort of made this indoors so we could control the light and control where the audience is looking? Thus, you get the creation of Teatro Olimpico, the first proscenium theater in 1585. The audience seating is here. You have that sort of half moon or semicircular orchestra. And finally, you have a proscenium arch, which is this arch here. Actors would stand here. First proscenium theater space. Here's another image of it. You can see this idea of vanishing point perspective. It looks like you're looking way down this hall, and actually, the end of this is not too far from the beginning of it, but it gives you that illusion that you're looking way down something. Same thing with these two little doors on the right and the left. The proscenium arch is pretty small. It's pretty small. I'm going to skip this video here. We're going to take a look at some designs. So there's an architect known as Sebastiano Serlio who created a sort of multi-purpose set design that could be used in these new indoor proscenium theaters that took advantage of this idea of vanishing point perspective. So something looks like it's very far away. All of these lines are leading the viewer's eyes to look at a single point that's very far away. You would paint things and build things to further that illusion. Another innovation is known as wing and drop scenery. So that is scenery painted on two-dimensional wings, which are on stage right and stage left, or flats. And the drop would be behind them, which is sort of a drop of a fabric, a backdrop. Now, if you just have little two-dimensional wings and flats, it's pretty easy. You can just move them off stage, switch them up, move them back on stage. Really easy. In fact, they developed little railroad tracks that would allow that to happen very quickly. And if you tie all those things to a single pole, people could, or donkeys could just go around in a circle and would wind up the ropes, which would pull the scenery off and simultaneously pull new scenery on stage on these little teeny railroad tracks. So wing and drop scenery allowed the illusion for an indoor theater of vanishing point perspective and quick scene changes. Here's an example. If you take a look, the wings are these flat painted flats is what they're called in theater, but they have the illusion of depth, and the backdrop is this sort of forest scene here. You imagine these could be pulled out very quickly and pulled back on if needed. Wings here, and drop is upstage where the white arrow is pointing. Wings are where the red arrows are pointing. Now we get to the English Renaissance, and that means talking a little bit about this guy, Shakespeare. You're probably familiar with him. He is one of the most well-researched personages in human history. So we got to talk about him a little bit. So before we talk about Shakespeare, let's talk about how companies and actors were composed during the English Renaissance. So first, companies had to be licensed by the nobility. They wanted to crack down on vagabonds or traveling theater companies. That was a no-no in Renaissance England. They said, listen, have it systemized, have everybody in London, or most people in London, and you have to have license from the nobility. So that's why you get a lot of companies that are just named after the lords that they're after. Lord Strange's Men was one company. The King's Men was Shakespeare's company. And before that, it was the Lord Chamberlain's Men, right? Named after the nobles who licensed you or sort of your supervisor for that particular company. Another time period in which only men could perform. Sorry, ladies, soon we'll move away from that. Soon we'll move away from that. But that was it. Also, they were professional. This is what they would do for their full-time job. If you're a member of a company, that's all you did. It wasn't amateur acting like in the Greek times. Though sometimes choruses were paid a little bit. But during the medieval times, I don't think people were paid very well, and certainly not professionally to be actors. But here, in Renaissance England, you could be a professional actor. No women on stage? Oh no! So what would they do for all these female roles? That's right, little boys. Usually prepubescent boys would play those roles. So think about all those famous Shakespearean roles, like Lady Macbeth urging Macbeth to go and kill the king, or Cleopatra, right? This wonderful tragic lover. All were like little boys, like 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, before their voice had cracked, prepubescent, maybe 9. Small roles, small people, wearing dresses. That's it. Don't ask me. That was acceptable at that time and that place. Nowadays, we would consider it very strange. But back then, that was normal. Let's talk a little bit about the different companies and plays. So, what was normal is for people to double roles. If you open up a Shakespeare play, there's tons and tons of very small roles, and we know about how many actors each company had. So, it's thought that one actor would play multiple roles in the course of one production. We still do that to this day in order to save money. Now, there was a high level of repetition in the plays. So there was new plays, but if that play was successful, it would be put into this rolling repertory system where there would be a different play produced every day. I didn't say new play because new plays would usually take about 2 or 3 weeks to get rehearsed and memorized and ready to rock and roll and debut. But there'd be a different play every day. So you could go to the theater, and unlike what we do nowadays, like when you see After Ashley, that's all that we're going to do. That's all those actors will do. It's not like they have 2 or 3 plays. That's all they're going to do. But back in Shakespeare's day, you would have, I think, up to 10 plays, would just be ready to rock, ready to go. The actors could pull out. They would have rehearsed. They would have memorized their lines. Maybe someone would help them out a little bit. But in an hour or two, they could be up to snuff and go onto the stage and do their plays. It's called a rolling repertory system. If it's popular, you could keep doing them, but you would change them up. So maybe you do Macbeth one day, as you like it the next day, then Macbeth again, then a new play, then Macbeth again, if audiences demand it, right? Professional theater, trying to make money. However, people did not like to see the same play again and again. In general, they liked new plays. So you have different versions of the same myth. There were several different Macbeths in Shakespeare's day. There's several different King Lears in Shakespeare's day. How is Shakespeare's different? Right? How is Shakespeare's different? Oh, this one's more popular. That one's more popular. Artists would watch each other's plays and make modifications, see who could attract the most audience members and make the most money at that time. Performances would happen daily, except because of the plague and except during Lent. There were also companies of only boy performers, and they would perform less often because they're children, and probably the repertoire would not be as much as compared to an adult actor. So stage spaces. During Shakespeare's era, there was not a lot of changeable scenery. Usually the theater was built and sort of that was it. Small pieces could be brought on or off, but there wasn't a whole new set design for every production, right? Remember, you're doing a new play or different play every day, so it couldn't be too much. Also, unlike the Italian Renaissance, in the English Renaissance, they had no perspective scenery. They weren't that interested in that in England for whatever reason. Now, there's 2 types of play spaces that London had, performance spaces. One is public. That's what we think about when we think about Shakespeare. It's the Globe, right? It's this outdoor or open air theater that was really in the shape of sort of like a hexagon or an octagon, but circular in general, and it had large capacity. In contrast to that, you had private theaters, which were indoor and smaller capacities. Originally, it was developed for boy companies. Remember, boys couldn't speak as loud as adult trained actors, so they would be indoors. Now, if you're indoors, you got to pay for, you don't have the sun for free like outdoors. You got to pay for candles or oil lights. So that means the private theaters were more expensive than the public theaters, sometimes twice as expensive as the public theaters. Now, anybody could go to either. Nobility would go to the public theater, and poor people, if they really wanted to, they could go to the private theater. They just had to pay double the price. So both people attended both types of theater. Private doesn't mean exclusive, just means more expensive. Here's an image from your book about public theaters. We're just going to briefly go over this. The audience seating area was 3 stories tall. It was polygonal, like an octagon. This sort of this sort of simplifies the external design of the English Renaissance public theater. Open to the sky, as we said before, so if it rains, they get wet. If you're over here sitting in the pit or standing in the pit. The stage is the thrust stage, so the audience is on 3 sides of the thrust stage, not a proscenium arch. It's on 3 sides. We had a discovery space, had a balcony scene, right? So get that famous Romeo and Juliet balcony scene. Right? Shakespeare writes a few more of those too. And there was a pit or yard where the groundlings would sit, or stand, really, to watch the show. That was the cheapest seats for 1 penny, or sometimes a penny, half of a penny, would be admittance to go and stand and watch a Shakespeare play. This example is the Globe. Here you have a cutaway of what an artist imagines the interior of one of these would look like. So we have 3 levels for audience seating here. We have the pit area where the groundlings would stand, a raised stage, a supported sort of covered area for the stage, a balcony area, and then some doors or a reveal space for if that's needed in the play. So there's only one sketch of what an inside of these public theaters looks like. And it dates from 1596. This Dutch guy went to London, I guess saw a play and drew a sketch of the Swan Theater, what it looks like on the inside. So this is what historians point to as evidence of what this looks like from the time period, as close as you can. No photographs, no video cameras, so this is pretty good. There's a recreation of Shakespeare's Globe called Shakespeare's Globe. Anyway, it opened in London in 1997 on the site of the original Shakespeare's original Globe. Remember, there's 2 globes, right? One of them burned down. The first globe burned down. They built the second one nearby. And this is on top of that foundation, built in 1997. So if you go to London, you can check it out. Sort of get something approximating pretty close to what performance in Shakespeare's day was like. So let's talk a little bit about 2 important playwrights from this era of the English Renaissance. First is Christopher Marlowe. Looking pretty cool here. Look at that sort of sexy look. Is he your theater history bae? Maybe. So here's his dates. Was fairly short-lived. However, he was university educated, took the time to go to, I believe, Oxford, got a bachelor's and a master's degree. And there's evidence that he was a spy. He worked for the Queen's Privy Council, so sort of like the English Renaissance CIA. It's thought he was doing some spy work. He died fairly young under mysterious circumstances in a bar fight, and then nobody ever was charged with his murder. So a little bit sketchy there too. Maybe he's into some sketchy stuff. Marlowe starts his writing career a little bit before Shakespeare, and unfortunately, because he died young, I think we were sort of robbed of a lot of gems that he probably would have written. And in fact, I would argue if Christopher Marlowe hadn't died young, we probably would be having Marlowe festivals and not Shakespeare festivals. But, you died. What you gonna do? So he's the master of blank verse, which is that unrhymed iambic pentameter style that Shakespeare and his contemporaries would write in. And he developed a lot of different things that Shakespeare would then innovate on. So Marlowe sort of originates this. Shakespeare sort of, to oversimplify it, and others, including Thomas Hayward and other people, John Ford, would sort of create more plays based on these ideas of historical tragedy, like Shakespeare writes Richard III, Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and all these other things. His masterwork is Dr. Faustus, and it's an interesting story of a man, Dr. Faustus, who sort of masters the physical world, and he desires more knowledge. So he makes a deal with the devil, this devil Mephistopheles, who comes and grants him extraordinary powers in exchange for his soul. But then when Dr. Faustus gets these powers, he just sort of goofs around. He goes and he steals the Pope's food, and then he gets Helen of Troy, the most attractive woman in the world, to come be his lover, and then at the end of the play, he comes to really regret his decision of selling his soul. He's sort of bored. So it's maybe a cautionary tale against falling prey to temptation or lust. Shakespeare, hey, gotta cover him, right? Shakespeare. So here's his dates. Dies in 1616. And if you notice, he's just born the same year, or maybe 1 year after Marlowe. So maybe if Marlowe hadn't passed away, he'd be up there right with Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare was not university educated, unlike Marlowe. It's thought he was educated at grammar school back at Stratford upon Avon, where he was born, but there's no evidence that he ever went to any college or university or anything like that. What a lot of people miss is that Shakespeare himself was an actor. In fact, after he leaves Stratford upon Avon, there's just 10 years where we don't know what he's doing. Likely he's touring around or maybe working as a sort of a freelance actor in London, but he pops back up associated with the Globe and the Lord Chamberlain's men in London. And we just have this 10-year black hole of what Shakespeare's doing. But it's known that he was an actor, and a skilled one too, and a playwright. So he wrote 38 plays for sure. Historians argue he wrote part or collaborated on a few more, which, if you want to be generous, about 42, about 42 plays is what's associated with Shakespeare. And he made out like a bandit, retired wealthy, went back home, Stratford-upon-Avon, bought a nice house, lived a life for a few years, and then passed away. You know him from classics like what we'll be doing next semester, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Tempest, all these other shows. So that concludes our lecture for today. Next time, if you want to get ahead, read chapter 7, page 162 to 182, and that is on acting. And we'll start our unit on the actor. That'll also lead into our first project, which is the acting project, where you'll have a chance to approach work as if you were an actor. Ooh. And finally, if you want to get ahead a little bit, you can start reading She Kills Monsters. She Kills Monsters is a little bit shorter than Antigone, which we've read before, but I think it's a lot more enjoyable and you'll probably read it faster. But if you're crunched for time over the weekend, it's an enjoyable read. You can get started on that. All right, thank you very much. Hopefully I'll be well enough to see you in class on Tuesday. I hope so. If not, maybe you'll get another video lecture like this. But anyway, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.